going to talk about foundation paper piecing. And first we are going to talk about the pattern. When you first begin foundation paper piecing, one of the stumbling blocks or the hardest things to get through when you're learning is understanding the pattern itself. Oftentimes, foundation paper piece patterns are designed different. Sometimes the seam allowance that goes around the entire pattern is included, and sometimes it's not. It really depends on how that designer designed the pattern and how they put their pieces together. When you get into more advanced paper piecing, a lot of times the pattern won't include the seam allowance because they just assume you're familiar with paper piecing. You add the 1/4 inch seam allowance around it on your own. In my patterns for the Skill Builder block of the month, I made sure to include the 1/4 inch seam allowance on the outside of the pattern so that you don't have to draw that in on your own. And you'll see that that's kind of a lighter dotted line around the pattern. Another thing that can become a little bit of a challenge is if you're printing a pattern from your home printer. Not all designs fit on an 8.5 by 11. And so that can cause a little bit of a challenge for the person designing the pattern. So what we have to do when we design the paper piece patterns is we have to add some guidelines here that show up on the bleed margin of your paper that show you where you're going to cut and how you can piece these pieces together. And so I'm going to show you with the Switz block that we're making this month how to cut up our pieces, tape them back together, and prepare for paper piecing. The other thing that you will notice too is sometimes patterns have multiple pieces. So for the Switz block, we have this square and a square piece here that's going to be all one thing that we're going to do together. So when we paper piece, we're going to do this block, okay? But then you have these outer pieces which we are going to do individually, and then at the very end when the paper piecing is done, we're going to assemble those outer pieces to the inside block. Now, not all pattern pieces are like that. If you were just making a square and a square block, you would just have one pattern piece and that's it. You wouldn't have to assemble anything at the end. So that depends on the pattern. You'll notice the more advanced and very intricate, small, little like teapots and little paper piecing projects oftentimes have multiple patterns that have to be assembled at the end. It's not complicated. Once you start doing it often, you'll get used to it and it won't be such a stumbling block. So let's begin. What we need to first do is lay out. With your Switz block, it's going to print out on 4 pieces of 8.5 by 11 paper. Very important that you print out at 100% no scale. Do not let your printer scale it down. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a block that's probably going to come out to about 10 inches finished or 11 inches finished instead of 12.5 inch finished. So if it's printed out full size, we are good to go. What you're going to notice is on the bleed margins on the outside of your 8.5 by 11s, the pattern was kind of repeated. So this section right here and this section right here is the same exact thing. If we just butted these 2 pieces of paper together and taped them together, you obviously can see here that that pattern would not match up and you would have one weird looking square that wasn't actually square. So let me see if I can get this on the camera so you can see a little bit better. If I just butt those 2 together, you're going to notice that our lines don't actually line up. And that's because this section on the bleed margin of the paper is repeated so that you know how to line these up. And that's something that I built into the pattern so that you could piece them together easily. Now, to make it proper, really, both of those bleed margins need to be removed and they need to be butted up next to each other. If you were to just cut this bleed margin off and cut that bleed margin off, taping them together would be kind of hard because you would have nothing there. You would literally be butting them together and taping them together. An easier solution to that is to actually choose one of them that you want to trim up. So I'm going to choose my bottom piece. Okay, I'm going to lay this one down. With paper scissors, I'm going to go in and I'm going to trim off on that dotted line here only where this pattern needs to meet up. I'm not going to trim the seam allowance around the block, just where I'm trying to fix and piece together my pattern. So I'm going to cut that off. And so now I have no more bleed seam allowance there. It wasn't a seam allowance, it was just the bleed margin of the paper. So I've got that nice and clean. But if you look on this piece, I still have that bleed margin right here. I'm going to leave that on, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover it up with this paper, and I'm going to tape it. And then our lines are going to match up perfectly, and we still have our seam allowance here on the outside, which is good. So I'll go ahead, and I think the best tape to use is Scotch tape. Of course, I don't have any Scotch tape, so I'm using clear packing tape, which honestly is not the best choice because when you stitch through it, it's a little bit too thick. So if you're going to use a weird tape like this and you don't have Scotch tape, try and keep the tape off of the dark black lines where we're going to be stitching. Then you don't have to worry about stitching through something so thick and heavy. So I'm going to tape those two together. So those two pieces are now taped together. Everything lines up. And so I've got that section of my block done. Now I'm going to do the same exact thing for this side of my block. Alright, we have gotten our foundation paper pieces put together. They are assembled, taped together, and we are ready to start choosing our fabrics. Another difficult step with foundation paper piecing is the matter of what size fabrics are going to work for the pieces in the pattern. And this is just something that will take practice when you first begin, and you'll get better over time. There's going to be two different questions you can ask here. Foundation paper piecing is perfect when you have a ton of scraps and you want to use them, and you're not really particular about what's going to go here and what's going to go there. I just have scraps and I'm going to go with it as I please. That works really well because you can go into your scrap bin and you can pull out a piece that's, looks pretty big, and you'll figure out, is this going to work here or not. Although the thing is, when you're not working with scraps and you're working with fat quarters or yardage, and you really need to figure out what size do I need here, I can't just cut a huge chunk out of my fat quarter. How can you determine what will fit in that space? The best way to do that is pretty much get your cutting mat or your ruler and do some guesstimating here. What you're going to do, like this piece here, this triangle piece that's going to go onto the square. I would line this up on my ruler or my mat and kind of just eyeball what's going on here. If I have a piece of fabric that needs to cover the width from the point to the side of this piece, and it needs to be at least high enough, and we're talking about seam allowances. Now remember, you can't see the seam allowance is not marked on the inside of your template. So in actuality, the seam allowance would be like right about here, but that's not marked, okay? But the seam allowance is marked on the outside, so you want to keep that 1/4 inch seam allowance that's over here in mind when you're measuring. So I'm looking at this, and the seam allowance would land on 3.5 if I measured this. So we want a piece at least a 1/2 inch bigger on all sides. That gives you some wiggle room. And sometimes when you're first beginning, I say the bigger the scrap, the better. I mean, commonly we don't want to waste fabric. You know, when you love your fabric, you don't want to waste it. And so you want to use the smallest piece you possibly can to make it work. But when you first begin paper piecing, that can be really frustrating. So I always suggest to use a larger scrap and have too much than end up with too little. Now what would happen if you had a piece that was too little? If you had a piece that was too little, you would lay it on here. You know, you have your 1/4 inch, and I'm working on the wrong side right now, but you would lay it over, and when you get done sewing it, you would flip it over, and you would not have enough to cover the entire piece and seam allowance. And so you would have to rip it off and try again. That happens, and that will happen to you guaranteed. It happens to every single paper piecer, whether you're a beginner or you're advanced. When we're beginners, we don't know what size we need. When we're more advanced, we get lazy and we're like, this will fit, and we want to really scringe on our fabric, and we don't want to use too much. So it happens. We end up having this happen, and we have to rip it out. And it's not fun ripping out on paper piecing because we're using such a short stitch length that ripping it out is time consuming, and it can just mess with the quality of your template when you have holes in it and all of that. So I say the bigger the better, and just practice, and you will start to get a hang of how much fabric you need to cover the whole entire piece. So when you're working with yardage, back to what I was saying, you can estimate by measuring it. So like I said, this is about a 3.5 inch wide, and then if I flip it the other way here, it's about, with the seam allowances, 6.5 inches at the widest point. And so I would at least add a 1/2 inch to that or more. So that would give me, approximately a 4 by 7 piece of fabric. You could even do 4.5 by 7.5, 5 by 8 piece of fabric, and that would give you a good range to work with. The other thing with that is, the reason we need to add so much to it is sometimes the angles are really weird. So on this pattern template, you've got a very sharp, odd triangle here, and so if you don't have just the right size, when you flip it over, again, just like that, you're going to have a little bit of your thing peeking out, and it's not going to fit. But over here on this side, it's so narrow, you have tons of extra fabric. And so you have this tendency to want to skimp on fabric, but it's not going to work for this wider piece up here. So that's important to know. So in the instructions for this Switz block, I've included what I would use as an estimated amount of fabric that should fit your pieces. You can also try and guesstimate yourself as well. And if you're using scraps, you could sit here all day long and test it out. Pull your scrap out and see, is that going to fit? Flip it over. Is that going to fit right there? No, try another one. And you could go that route. That is how you're going to prepare your fabrics. For this block, I already did my Skill Builder block in my solid fabrics, and I did that before I made this tutorial. And so I decided to make the block again for the sake of this tutorial, but this time I'm making it in some prints that's not going to go in my Skill Builder quilt. I just wanted to use this, maybe make a pillow out of it or something, I'm not sure yet. This is a new fabric collection by Barry J. It's called Bijou, and it's very pretty, and I've had the opportunity to play with it in a couple other blocks that I'm working on. And so I'm going to be using that for this video tutorial, and we're going to come back and start getting down to the machine and start paper piecing here in the next video. Alright, I'm over at my machine now, and we are going to begin foundation paper piecing. I wanted to show you my setup. This is my ideal setup when I'm foundation paper piecing. I have my machine right here. I've got a small cutting mat, rotary, and 1/4 inch. This is the at a 1/4 inch. It has a lip on it here, and that lip is exactly a 1/4 inch, and it's real handy when you're paper piecing. And I've got my fabric already pre-cut, or I've got my scraps, and I have my paper piecing templates here. And down here below, where it's a little bit darker, I have a TV tray that's covered with home deck fabric and batting that I use as a pressing table next to my machine, and I have my iron. So that way, in between, I can press. I don't have to get up. I can sit right here. I don't have to move. I have everything I need. If you don't have an iron and a pressing table close by your machine, then I would suggest one of those seam rollers. It looks like a little itty bitty rolling pin, and you can press your seams open to the side or whatever you need with the little pin, a rolling pin, at your machine without having to bring your iron over. And that works really good for paper piecing. It'll be really important that you do press your seams between each piece that we sew, so that everything lays flat. So definitely figure out a solution for that. So I have everything set up here. The next thing that's really important is that you have your machine set to a short stitch length of at least 1 to 2, somewhere in that range. Right now I have mine set up to 1.5 in stitch length. And then I have a open toe foot on my machine so I can see where I'm going, nothing's in the way. I can see the lines clearly on my pattern. So I am all set to begin paper piecing. The very first piece that we piece usually can be the one where you have to stop and think, does this look right? Every time you sit down to paper piece. I mean, you could paper piece like 10 times, and if you don't do it that often, you're going to kind of have to say, wait a minute, how do I start again? And so that's completely normal. Do not feel bad if you have to question every single time or really look at instructions every single time, because it's normal. So I have my paper piece pattern. First we're going to work on the inner square and a square block, and then later we will do the outer pieces that are going to go on in the assembly at the very end. So when we work, the fabric will always be sewn to the side of the pattern that does not have lines. So we will use the side with the lines as a guide, but the fabric will actually be sewn to the wrong side of the pattern. So the white side of the pattern. And so what you're going to do is you're going to have to look through the pattern and to see the lines. So it really helps having a window or a lamp or a light box or something close by, and I have a window right here, so that I can see the lines through the paper on the other side. Another reason why you don't want to use anything very thick for your foundation, I just use basic white printer paper. It works great. So first I'm going to start with piece number 1, and on the pattern that's A1 here, that's the square that's in the center, and I'm going to flip my pattern over so the wrong side's showing, the white unprinted side's showing, and I'm going to lay my fabric right side up. So the good side is looking straight at me, and the wrong side of the fabric is touching the white wrong side of the pattern. So you've got right side, right side. Right sides are facing out. I'm going to line it up how I would like it to be. It up, and you can pin it or you can just hold it carefully when you sew. For right now and for beginners, for the sake of this video, I'm going to pin so you can see. I have my pins down here. So I'm going to line this up. I'm using the light in the window to make sure that I am covering the square completely with a 1/4 inch all around all sides. And I'm going to pin on the side of the pattern that has the lines, so the right side of the pattern. So I've just stuck a pin right here. And you really only probably need one pin. I'll probably put that in the center, just hold it in place. So I've got it in place now. And I'm making sure that it covers all sides, and it does. So the next piece that we're going to do is piece number 2, A2 on the pattern, which is this piece here. I'm going to grab my piece of fabric, I'm going to flip it back over so that I'm looking at the right side of the fabric, and I'm going to line up my fabric here just like so. Okay, so this is the piece right here that we plan to cover, but I need to fold it the opposite direction so that I can stitch right here in place, and then the stitching, when it's done, I will be flipping this over just like so. So it will be flipped over and pressed just like that. So you want to make sure that when it's flipped over, it covers that entire piece, just as we talked about before. So when it's flipped over, is it going to cover an entire piece of A2? And this piece is very generously sized, so I know it's going to cover. So I'm going to, after I've made sure that it's going to cover, I'm going to go ahead and lay this down. And it's flipped the opposite direction, it's going to end up. And I'm going to go ahead and pin from the right side of the pattern. So now I have this piece in place. So that piece is in place, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm ready to stitch my first line. So I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to look at the side that has the printed lines. The one that we're working on right now is this black line that's between piece A1 and piece A2. I'm going to stitch on that line. Now when you're working and you're planning on sewing around the edge of the seam allowance, right here, okay, I'm planning on starting stitching right here. And there's seam allowance right there. So whenever you're working on the edge of a pattern where the seam allowance begins, you want to sew from the outside of the pattern through the seam allowance and on that dark black line, then outside the line on the seam allowance all the way to the edge. And when you do that, backstitch and backstitch, start and end with backstitching. The reason I say that is when we start ripping the paper out, backstitching helps keep those stitches in place. If you don't backstitch, you'll start tearing your paper out, and that seam allowance may lose its stitches and it won't be as secure. I don't suggest backstitching when you're working on the inside of a block, like we will be in the Geo swirl. But when you're working on the outside edge and you're going through the seam allowance, I suggest backstitching. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to sew through my seam allowance on the black line, out of the seam allowance, and I'm going to be backstitching at the start and finish. And again, remember, I have my stitch length set to 1.5. It's very small stitch length. And that's going to perforate the paper as I sew and make it easier to pull out at the very end. So I've just stitched that in place, and I actually stitched through the seam allowance there all the way across, and I backstitched, okay? Now you can take your pins out, and if you fold over that piece of fabric that you just put on here for A2, and make sure that it covers the whole thing. Mine generously covers the entire piece of A2. I'm going to now take this over right here to my pressing table, and I'm going to press my piece down and make sure that seam that I just stitched is really flat, nice and flat. Okay, so now that is nice and flat before I move on to my next one. So now we're going to do the same thing. We have 3 more to go. Now it's a square and square. Now, if this was the only block that we were making, at this point we would rip the paper out and press our block and we would be done. But we have these outside pieces that we're going to be added to the block here. And so I'm going to leave the paper on until we assemble the block. So I'm going to set this aside and work on these outer pieces instead now. So I got my outer piece here. And each outer piece I decided to use one print fabric and for the smaller piece and then a solid for the larger piece. And so for this block, same idea, you got to stop and think for a second. How does this come together? How does this work? So what we're going to do, again, is the fabric's going to go on the blank white side of the paper. So I'm going to flip this over. And I'm going to start with my printed piece, which is going on piece number 1. Okay, and I want to make sure that it is covering my whole entire piece. I'm going to hold this up to the light right here and make sure it's covering completely. And make sure that I have at least a 1/4 inch going over that black line in between two pieces. I have about 1/2 inch just so that I have everything covered. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab my next piece, line up the edges, just like so, and then I'm going to do the little test and flip it over. If it was sewn, was that going to cover? And nope. See, if you look here, my tip right here is not going to be covered, so I need to adjust my piece downward a little ways and then try again and make sure it covers, and that way, just like that, it covers. And I'm going to hold it up to the light again and make sure that everything is covered. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin on the side with the lines, and I'm going to sew on the black line, just as we did with the previous piece. Once I've sewn that, I'm going to bring it back over here, and I'm going to fold back my piece of paper that's on that second piece and trim up my seam allowance. This one didn't have much to trim off. And then I'm going to go ahead and press my pieces open. And that is the only two pieces that are required for this outer pattern piece. So what we're ready to do is we're ready to go ahead and trim up the triangle. So same thing as I did on the last block, I'm going to line up my ruler with the edge of the paper and trim up that excess fabric. The angle that I'm sitting with the rotary, it's not cutting very good, so I suggest not trying to reach over your sewing machine. And so there is that final piece ready to assemble to the block. So you're going to repeat this for the next 3 pattern pieces that are exactly like this, and then we'll come back and assemble our entire Switz block. Alright, I have finished piecing these outer 4 pieces for my Switz block, and now we're going to talk about how to actually assemble the final Switz block. What we're going to do is we're going to actually leave the paper foundation still on the pieces when we assemble the block, but we're going to get rid of the extra 1/4 inch seam allowance on the paper pattern that's around all sides. So you're not going to actually, we're not going to be cutting our fabric. You do not want to cut your fabric or the seam allowance on your fabric. We're just going to get rid of that bulky paper in the seam allowance. Let me show you an example here. I've already trimmed this one up, and if you see, the fabric goes around the pattern piece 1/4 inch on all sides, but I've gotten rid of that 1/4 inch on the paper. So I'm going to show you how to do that carefully. You have to be so careful when you're doing this so that you don't actually cut your fabric. So I have my piece here, and I'm going to go ahead and fold back my yellow piece that's number 2 piece. And I'm going to go ahead and with my paper scissors, I'm going to fold back all fabric that might be in the way. And I am going to trim off the seam allowance on that black solid line. Rotate it, make sure none of the fabric is in the way here. And continue trimming. You don't want to even cut the seam allowance of your fabric at all. You just want to get it out of the way completely. And from right here I could just rip that last piece off. And you can discard all of that. So now I have the 1/4 inch seam allowance cut off the pattern template, and I have the fabric. So I've done that already on all of my pieces. And I'm going to go ahead and start assembling my block. So what we have here is our square and square block. And one of the things that's important about leaving these paper pieces on the patterns as we assemble is it can really help you line up your pieces properly. If you take them off, you kind of lose where the ends actually are, and you want to line those up. And so you can take the paper off. Some people prefer to take it off. They find it's too bulky when you're piecing your pieces together. It's just a little bit harder to line things up if you do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and line one of these units up with our square and square block, and I am going to look from this view right here and make sure that the edge of the pattern template on this side lines up with the edge of the pattern template on this side. And I'm just going to line it up carefully and pin these two pieces together, and I've got them lined up right sides together, pattern pieces on the outside. And I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew them together with a scant 1/4 inch seam. And I still have my open-toed foot on my machine, and I'm going to go ahead and get my 1/4 inch foot instead so that I can be sure that I have a perfect scant 1/4 inch. So I'm going to change that out. Stitch those together. You might slightly sew on the paper just a tad, and that's okay. So now I have these two pieces sewn together, and for right now I'm going to leave the seams pressed towards one side. Okay, and I'm just going to finger press this. So I'm pressing the seams outwards towards the outer piece from the square and square block. Just like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and do my other side. we'll have a completed Switz block.